Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are setting out to map a monumental timeline, the 200,000-year step-by-step evolution of human history. You know, far too often, early history gets taught as if civilization just sort of suddenly popped up in scattered pockets around the globe. But we're going to track the latest archaeological and genetic evidence to see how a small band of humans in Africa systematically built the literal blueprint for everything we call civilization today.
Okay, let's dive right in. We'll be moving step by step through the Cradle of Humanity, the birth of culture, the first complex societies, rival empires of the Nile, the Iron Revolution, and finally, the Queens of Kush.
Section 1, the Cradle of Humanity, and where our deepest roots lie. Our biological origin actually begins in Africa's Great Rift Valley. Think of this massive geological fault as a biological crucible, a harsh testing ground where nature pitted early humans against fierce predators and extreme environments, forcing them to adapt, survive, and ultimately evolve. When you really look at the sheer scale of this timeline, it's mind-blowing. Step 1, Homo sapiens emerge around 200,000 years ago. Then, Step 2, by 160,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans are literally walking the earth. We know this from a skull discovered in Ethiopia named Idiltu, which translates to firstborn. The anatomy of Idiltu's face and brain case? It's exactly like ours. Think about that for a second. While Europe was packed with Neanderthals, completely modern humans like Idiltu were already thriving in Africa. It wasn't until Step 3, around 80,000 years ago, that these modern humans finally began their massive migration out of the continent. And when geneticists looked closer, they discovered something absolutely incredible in our mitochondrial DNA. That's the genetic signature passed down strictly from mother to child. Scientists identified a common, direct maternal ancestor for every single living person on Earth. She's known as mitochondrial Eve, and she lived in Africa around 200,000 years ago. So what does this all mean? It means that literally every human being alive today, no matter what we look like, is descended from a common Black ancestor. Our genetic differences are quite literally just skin deep. Moving on to Section 2, the birth of culture and the spark of human creativity. Because when those early humans finally began migrating out of Africa around 80,000 years ago, they weren't just carrying basic survival instincts. No, they were carrying a rapidly developing culture. For the longest time, there was this historical myth that art and symbolic thinking began in Europe. People always pointed to the famous Lascaux caves in France, dating back about 35,000 years. But wait until you hear this. Deep in the Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists discovered engraved ochre blocks and actual painting kits dating back 77,000 years. This staggering discovery completely pushes the timeline of complex human cognition tens of thousands of years earlier than we thought. It places the true birth of art firmly in Africa. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive cognitive leap our ancestors took. Let's look at this progression step by step. Step 1, they didn't just find rocks, they carved purposeful, symbolic, hashed etchings right into them. Step 2, they ground that ochre down, mixing it with water and minerals to literally manufacture paint. And Step 3, they applied this paint to their bodies or their surroundings to communicate complex group identity and shared meaning. This is huge. It shows humans rising above the daily panic of basic survival to create the world's very first rich cultural heritage. Section 3, the first complex societies, moving from a green Sahara to the Nile. Our next big step forward brings us to the dawn of agriculture, animal domestication, and a radical climate shift that changed the course of civilization forever. Let's walk through this environmental progression because it is incredibly dramatic. Step 1. Over 10,000 years ago, the Sahara wasn't a desert at all. It was a green, vibrant savanna, totally filled with lakes, hippos, and grazing cattle herds. But then we hit Step 2. A slow, brutal climate change dried out the land, turning that lush savanna into a barren desert by 4000 BC. Step 3, this massive environmental crisis forced early pastoral communities to migrate toward the only reliable water source they had left, the fertile Nile Valley. This essentially pushed the ancestors of both the Egyptians and the Nubians together. Finally, Step 4, settling by the Nile led to reliable agriculture, which created food surpluses. Because not everyone had to farm anymore, populations divided into specialized roles. We're talking artisans, builders, and the complex societies we now recognize as early civilization. So, the crucial point here is how this newly complex society actually organized itself. For decades, Mesopotamia was credited as the sole birthplace of early writing. But in 1988, archaeologists at Abydos in Egypt made a game-changing discovery, a tomb belonging to the Scorpion King dating back to 3250 BC. Inside, 150 small ivory tags covered in carved symbols. And these weren't just simple drawings, they were phonetic symbols indicating royal property and origin. This proved, without a doubt, that writing developed independently and simultaneously right here in Africa, used as a powerful tool to organize labor, resources, and state power. And organizing all that labor led to some seriously unprecedented feats. 2,300,000. That is the staggering number of 2.5-ton stone blocks used to construct the Great Pyramid of Giza during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. And contrary to a very popular myth, this incredible African construction was not built by slaves. Actually, it was built by conscripted Egyptian citizens. These were farmers who, during the months when the Nile flooded and they literally couldn't work their fields, paid their taxes to the state through their labor on this monumental project. Pretty amazing, right?
Section 4. Rival Empires of the Nile, focusing on Egypt and Kush. Stepping into the era of great kingdoms, we have to look south of Egypt. We're going to explore the intense intimacy and the bitter rivalry between Egypt and its incredibly powerful southern neighbor, the Kingdom of Kush.
Tracking this timeline step by step reveals a wild shift in absolute power. First, by 2500 BC, Kush's capital city, Kerma, had a population of 10,000, completely rivaling Egypt's power. But Egypt heavily coveted Nubia's gold, what they called the skin of the gods, which they needed for their pharaoh's passage into the afterlife. So, the next step, in 1500 BC, Egypt's Thutmose I aggressively sacked Kerma. He even went so far as to strap the body of the fallen Nubian king to the prow of his ship. This brutal act led to centuries of Egyptian oppression over Kush. But, empires always rise and fall. By 750 BC, Egypt was fragmented and weak, and that opened the door for a dramatic turning of the tables when the Kushite king Pi marched north.
I shall let Egypt taste the taste of my fingers. With this fierce declaration, Pi launched what was essentially a holy war. You see, the Kushites had adopted the Egyptian god Ammon, and they truly believed they were better, purer worshippers of Ammon than the Egyptians themselves. Pi's army swept north, conquering and reuniting a fragmented Egypt and firmly establishing the historic 25th dynasty, the famous era of the Black Pharaohs of the Nile.
Section 5. The Iron Revolution and Independence Technological Leaps. Let's move over and see how this builds in a completely different part of the continent. Because while empires clashed on the Nile, deep in the lush forests of Central Africa, a radical new technology was being born from the ground up. Once again, we're seeing history being totally rewritten. It was previously assumed that ironworking was discovered exclusively in Turkey around 1500 BC, and then it just slowly trickled down to the rest of the world. But new archaeological evidence proves that small communities of craftspeople in Central Africa, while trying to fire ceramics in their lateritic soil, actually discovered iron smelting independently. This accidental byproduct was a massive technological leap. Step by step, it rapidly changed their entire economy, from hunting and gathering to advanced, highly efficient agriculture using strong iron tools. And this technological leap sparked a massive cultural expansion. On one hand, you have the Nok culture emerging in Nigeria around 900 BC. Traveling artists were creating these sublime, intricately detailed terracotta sculptures featuring sophisticated hairstyles and heavy jewelry. It's literally the earliest sculptural art in Africa outside of Egypt. Then, at the exact same time, you have the massive Bantu migration. Starting around 3000 BC, these communities began moving across the continent. They carried their language and their advanced iron technology with them, ultimately populating 2/3 of modern sub-Saharan Africa and completely transforming the demographic face of the entire continent. Section 6. The Queens of Kush and the Power of Meroe. For our final era in this explainer, we return to the Nile, specifically to the iron-working center of Meroe, the new capital of Kush. Because here, this ancient African civilization is about to face the ultimate ancient military machine, the Roman Empire. But before we get into Rome, we absolutely have to talk about who was leading Kush. One of the most fascinating aspects of Kushite society was its incredible lineage of ruling queens. They held the title of Kandake. In a span of just 100 years, Kush was ruled by 4 tremendously powerful Kandakes. These were women renowned for their fiercely effective and decisive leadership in the face of incredible existential danger.
Let's break down this incredible historical clash step by step. Step 1. In 31 BC, Rome defeats Cleopatra's Egypt and immediately begins pushing south into Kushite territory. Step 2. The Romans meet the Candace Amanirenas. She is a fierce, one-eyed military strategist who leads a grueling 5-year tactical war against the invading Roman forces. Step 3. In a stunning military maneuver, Kushite forces raid a Roman outpost and actually manage to capture a bronze head of the Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar himself. Finally, step 4. Battered by Amanirenas' clever military tactics, the mighty Roman Empire actually gives up its advance. Amanirenas forces Augustus Caesar to the negotiating table, securing a peace treaty that guaranteed her kingdom's independence for another 400 years. No way, right?
And the fate of that captured bronze head is hands down my absolute favorite detail. Amanirenas showed her utter disdain for the Roman emperor by burying his bronze head directly under the threshold of her grand temple in Meroe. This ensured that every single person who walked into the temple would literally step on the face of Augustus Caesar. Talk about sending a message. This incredible account wasn't just recorded by the Romans, it's carved into stelas by the Kushites themselves, using the Meroitic script. That's a complex African written language that modern computers still haven't fully deciphered to this day.
Which brings us to our conclusion, and a question you really need to take away from this explainer today. If Africa gave humanity its very blueprint, from the first anatomical humans and the birth of art, to independent agriculture, the invention of writing, the smelting of iron, and empires powerful enough to halt Rome in its tracks, why have we so often been taught a history of civilization that starts anywhere else? Africa is not some static footnote in the past. It is the dynamic, inventive wellspring from which all human history flows. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and keep questioning the history you've been taught.